this idea in Spengler of that he talks about in this chapter where new media like the newspaper are responsible for melting down the Gutenbergian mental phase space of the mind, forms something of an antinomy, I think, when it comes to accounting for the process of the decline of the Western mind, because Spengler's model obviously is an a priori model which prefers a predetermined course in which every civilization, as it winds down, gradually the mentality disintegrates, it loses its cognitive abilities and begins to decline into an aphasic and amnesic mental phase space in which thinking of the higher sort begins to become more and more difficult for it. And in Spengler's whole thesis here, as we have seen all along, is that this is a predetermined process. The opposite point of view then, which is the closest that he gets to in this, to suggesting in this chapter, is that new media, such as the newspaper, and then of course radio, telegraph, and then later now with computer, internet, TV, are responsible for encouraging disliteracy and illiteracy. That's the opposite point of view. It's the one that I tend to favor. But nonetheless, Spengler's point of view of a morphologically predetermined elimination of the mind as it enters into the senile phases of its winter stage is a point of view worth considering, and that the evidence does show, it does tend to have some weight to it. I think the process of extermination, of mental extermination, is different in each case and happens for different reasons. In the case of the Chinese there, the extermination of the intellect was forcible. It happened when Qin Shi Huangdi in about 220 BC created the first Chinese universal state with the burning of the books and his persecutions of Chinese intellectuals like the Confucians and the Taoists, whose philosophies were at odds with his own philosophy of legalism, which is basically nihilistic and very cynical. We can see the whole process taking place there under force. He didn't like Confucianism because Confucianism upheld the cult of the ancestors and regard for tradition and the traditional forms of the past, whereas Qin Shi Huangdi saw himself as inaugurating a whole new golden age of Chinese civilization in which he himself was the single ancestral founder, and all authority should be deferred to him, not any past ancestors, as the great creator of this age of new social archetypes, new technologies. You get the standard weights and measures are standard. You get a standardized script, standardized coinage. New roads were put into place. Taller buildings were built. All of this new infrastructure that was created under Qin Shi Huangdi, he himself wanted to take the credit for. So all the Confucians were persecuted. The mystical philosophies of Taoism, which after all were hostile to civilization, all of this was persecuted under his regime, so that the Holocaust of the burning of the books that took place there took place under force in this case. And as a result of that, there has been a tremendous loss of Chinese learning. And any of the classics that have survived from before the period of Qin Shi Huangdi are at best normally fragmentary, and very little has survived of what was actually once there, which was quite a bit more than what has survived. So it was a tremendous loss. In ancient Egypt, on the other hand, the process was a slow and gradual one that doesn't seem to have any kind of attributable cause that we can track. In the 19th dynasty, we have the rise of popular culture, the rise of pornography and beast fables and folk tales. We can see this preference for popular culture. The Middle Egyptian language, the script shifted to the preference for the vernacular. Then by the time of the 21st dynasty, we can see in the funerary papyri that image becomes preferred over text. And when these funerary papyri were first written on the walls of these tombs that were dug into the Valley of the Kings, the big long tombs, and these texts were put up on the walls starting with Thutmose I in the New Kingdom, they had big long texts associated with them, and so all the texts, such as the Book of the Caves and the Sacred Book of the Cow, they all had long texts associated with them that were written on the walls. But by the time we get to the 21st dynasty, the text has disappeared and all that's left are the images. Then by the time we get down to the 22nd dynasty, all the texts and all the literature, including the funerary papyri, are gone. They have disappeared unaccountably. And that's it for the Egyptian mind. The funerary papyri do, of course, resurface during the 26th dynasty, during the so-called Sayyid revival, but the literature was gone for good by that point. So the Egyptian mind had exterminated itself the 22nd dynasty is its death knell. We can also track the process in ancient Rome, which is a gradual one, which with the rise of the Caesars there seems to have its own inner acausal morphology. We move from the golden age of Augustus, in which we have the writers, we have Virgil, Horace, Livy, and Ovid, great writers, all of them, to the next generation, the Silver Age of Nero, in which now we have Seneca, Petronius, and Lucan. We can see a diminishing of literary ability there. Lucan's Pharsalia is not as good as Virgil's Aeneid, for one thing. The plays of Seneca were written not to be performed, but to be read aloud, since the gladiatorial shows were already putting the plays out of business. Why go see people faking death when you can go to the arenas and see it happening for real? So Seneca's plays take place, this is why they're so crudely violent. Then as we move to the third literary generation of Martial, Juvenal, and Suetonius, we get a further diminishing of literary ability. Suetonius is not as good a historian as Livy, or as good a historian as Tacitus, and we can see a real decline of literary ability there. Then after that generation, by the time we get to about 200 AD, Roman literature is largely a done deal. It's finished. Marcus Aurelius in roughly 160 writes his Meditations in Greek now, which becomes the preferred language. Latin begins to fall out as the literary language, and Greek takes over, and from this point on, Roman literature is a done deal. It's finished. And the great main literary intellects of the time are the Church Fathers and the scholastics of Magian civilization, such as Plotinus, Father Origen, Iamblichus, Tertullian, and Mani. This is a different civilization with different scripts, different language conventions, a whole different order of mentality. The Latin tradition is gone by that point, so we can see it slowly exterminating itself from within without any attributable cause. In the case of the West, the attributable causes do seem to be the acceleration of all the new media and the meltdown of the mental phase space, a la Paul Virilio's idea of dromology, in which real-time technologies today have now eliminated the deferred mental phase space in which the mind has time to think about and reflect upon events, and therefore then to write about them. Because everything happens all at once and everybody's response now is immediate, the rapid acceleration in metabolism and the tempo of writing and thinking has forced the high literary forms to crumble and disintegrate into the realm of comic books and bestsellers, which have completely taken that over. And the new gadgets, iPhones and Kindles and Nooks and all these things are not helping the matter at all. They do seem to be contributing to the extermination of the book, which is what I've written about in my recent book, The New Media Invasion. So Spengler's ideas in here are good ones about how the newspaper determines what is true and what isn't. And one of the ways that it does this, Spengler says, is that by failing to report on certain events, it determines that those events don't exist by a conspiracy of silence. So it determines for the masses, these formless masses of the democratic period, what is true and what isn't, simply by its biases. We all know that if we listen to NPR, we're getting a liberal bias. If we watch Fox News, we're getting a right-wing bias. So the bias of whoever owns the means of reporting on the media always selects those stories and slants them from the editorial angle that's consistent with the politics of the ownership. And so we're never getting news in any objective sense, but the masses often fail to make these distinctions, and they think what they're hearing is what is true. And Spengler says in this chapter that for the masses, what is true is what they read in the newspapers and what they hear about. That becomes reality for them. Anything that isn't reported on doesn't exist. And so he says this is a caricature of freedom of the press. He says that the democratic sentimentalist will talk about the rights of man and freedom of the press, but he says that the realist will say, who owns this press that is supposedly representing freedom of the mind? And he says that this is a kind of Caesarian media. These are the Caesars of the media who are turning the masses into intellectual slaves who are being whipped about by the biases and angles of their stories that they are presenting to the masses, who are simply molded by these political interests. So there is no real freedom of the press here. That's all a joke. I think these criticisms are good ones, and they've become so common, I think, that they're almost cliches now. They weren't cliches back when Spengler is writing this, and you can see World War II getting ready to heat up here as well in his criticisms of democracy, and the Germans wanting to hold on to the aristocratic worldview. You can see this coming, I think, here. So that, in a nutshell, is his chapter on the philosophy of politics and his rant against democracy, which I think is a good one. I think what we have for democracy now is really a sham. It's a plutocracy governed by corporate interests, and all the politicians owe so many favors by the time they get into office that they pass laws in favor of corporate interests, not in favor of public welfare. I think the masses are just fodder for these massive government and corporate transnational corporations, and everything is warped and distorted in their favor. So these laws really aren't democratic in any real sense at all.